Welcome to Chapter 14 of Juvenile Justice, Global Issues in Juvenile Justice. This chapter broadens our perspective beyond the United States to examine juvenile delinquency, exploitation, and justice systems around the world. As we will see, juvenile offending is a universal phenomenon. The causal factors, characteristics of offenders, and challenges facing juvenile justice systems share striking similarities across very different cultures and economic conditions. We begin with a fundamental question. At what age should a child be held criminally responsible? We then examine the global scope of juvenile delinquency, the serious problem of juvenile exploitation and victimization, the international standards that guide how nations should treat juvenile offenders, and finally, the worldwide use of restorative justice as an alternative to formal court processing. As you work through this chapter, try to resist the tendency toward ethnocentrism, the habit of viewing other cultures through the lens of your own background and assumptions. The goal is to understand these systems on their own terms and to identify both what they share with the American system and where they genuinely differ. The chapter has 5 learning objectives. Objective 1 asks you to analyze the extent of delinquency around the world. How widespread is juvenile crime globally? How is it measured? And what challenges exist in comparing data across countries? Objective 2 asks you to identify the characteristics of juvenile offenders around the world. Who is most likely to offend, and are these characteristics similar across different nations and cultures? Objective 3 asks you to compare patterns of juvenile exploitation and delinquency among various regions. From human trafficking to child soldiers to gang involvement, how does exploitation and victimization of youth vary by region? Objective 4 asks you to understand the key international standards and documents, the Beijing Rules, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the RIDIA guidelines. And I'm just going to be honest, I probably don't pronounce that correctly. That shape how nations are expected to treat juvenile offenders. And Objective 5 asks you to discuss the use of restorative justice with juvenile offenders globally, understanding that many of the restorative justice practices used in the United States were actually borrowed from other countries. The age at which a child can be held criminally responsible is perhaps the most fundamental question in any juvenile justice system, and the variation around the world is striking. In the United States, the minimum age varies by state and can be as low as 6 years old in South Carolina. Federal crimes require a minimum age of 11. The United States allowed the execution of juvenile offenders until the Supreme Court's decision in Roper v. Simmons in 2005. England and Wales set the age at 10, but historically applied the doctrine of doli in capace, a presumption that children between 10 and 14 lack the capacity to form criminal intent. England abolished this presumption in 1998, lowering the effective bar. The Nordic countries set the age at 15 and are generally regarded as having the most welfare-oriented juvenile justice systems in the world. Norway actually raised its minimum age from 14 to 15 in 1990, moving in the opposite direction from the punitive trend seen elsewhere. Belgium sets the age at 18, the highest in Europe, treating virtually all juvenile offending as a welfare and educational matter rather than a criminal one. Japan, which is frequently praised for its low crime rates, lowered its minimum age from 16 to 14 in 2000 in response to concerns about rising youth violence, demonstrating that even countries with strong welfare traditions have faced pressure to adopt more punitive approaches. In Iran and countries governed by Sharia law, the age of responsibility is tied to religious definitions of puberty, 15 for boys and 9 for girls. This creates a situation where girls can be held criminally responsible and face adult-level punishments at a much younger age than boys. The UN's Beijing rules call for the age to not be set too low, bearing in mind the emotional, mental, and intellectual maturity of children. The UN has criticized nations that set the minimum at 12 or below. This is important to recognize because the United States, with minimum ages as low as 6 in some states, falls well below what the international community considers appropriate. The key takeaway is that this is not merely a semantic debate. The age of responsibility has profound real-world consequences for how children are processed through the justice system and what protections they receive. One of the most important insights in this chapter is that the evolution of juvenile justice philosophy has been a global phenomenon, not just an American one. The United States did not invent these ideas. It was part of a worldwide conversation. The welfare orientation dominated the late 1800s through roughly the 1950s. The foundational premise was that children who offend are in need of assistance and guidance, not punishment. This philosophy was exported from Europe to its colonies and influenced juvenile justice systems across North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. There is even debate about which country had the first formal juvenile court. Many scholars credit South Australia in 1890, 9 years before Cook County, Illinois in 1899. The due process era emerged globally from roughly the 1950s through the 1980s. By this time, serious problems had developed in welfare-oriented institutions. Child maltreatment, neglect, and abuse were common, and there was growing pessimism about whether treatment programs actually even worked. The response was to shift focus from the child's best interest to procedural fairness, ensuring that juvenile offenders had rights and that those rights were protected. This trend occurred in the United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere simultaneously. The punitive era began in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s. Media-driven fears about juvenile predators, rising youth violence in urban areas, and the political appeal of tough-on-crime messaging drove a shift toward punishment across much of the developed world. Japan and France, for example, saw similar rises in youth crime and political pressure for harsher responses. The result was more waivers to adult court, longer sentences, and a retreat from rehabilitation. The India example is particularly instructive because it illustrates how a single country's juvenile justice system can swing back and forth between these philosophies over time. From apprenticeship programs to the Whipping Act, to detention, to vocational rehabilitation, and most recently back toward adult criminal processing for serious juvenile offenders. With 1.3 billion people, roughly 1 in 6 of the entire human population, India's choices about juvenile justice matter enormously for the global picture. The global picture of juvenile delinquency is complex, but several clear patterns emerge. First, the scale. Juvenile arrests in Western Europe increased by approximately 50% between the mid-1980s and late 1990s. Countries in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states saw increases of more than 30% since 1995. The number of children in especially difficult circumstances, a key risk category, grew from 80 million to 150 million between 1992 and 2000. And 200,000 youth homicides occur globally each year, representing 43% of all homicides worldwide. But the data are hard to compare across countries. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has noted that there are many points in a juvenile system where data may not be accurately recorded. Definitions of delinquency vary, and information technology is limited in many nations. The concept of a youth being in conflict with the law has been developed as a working international definition to address these inconsistencies. The single most consistent predictor of increased delinquency across all regions studied is urbanization. As people migrate to cities in developing countries seeking employment, only to find insufficient jobs, slums form. Children in slums are socially excluded, exposed to family violence and instability, and drawn toward peer groups that offer the belonging and resources their families cannot provide them. UNDESA, or UNDESA, estimates that roughly 1 in 3 city dwellers, nearly 1 billion people, live in slum conditions. The gender gap in delinquency is universal. Male juvenile suspects outnumber females by more than 6 to 1 globally. In part, this reflects stronger social controls on girls' behavior in most societies, and in part, it reflects the role of violence and aggression in constructions of masculinity in patriarchal cultures. Group delinquency is the norm worldwide. About 2/3 of all delinquent acts are committed in groups. Differential association theory applies globally. When peer group messages favoring delinquency outnumber messages against it, youth are more likely to offend. The subcultures that emerge among delinquent youth share striking similarities across very different national contexts. The welfare imprisonment link is one of the most important findings in the literature. Countries that invest heavily in social welfare, the Nordic nations, Belgium, have both higher child well-being scores and lower detention rates. Countries that prioritize market competition over welfare provision tend to have higher incarceration rates, particularly for marginalized groups. This slide addresses perhaps the most disturbing dimension of global juvenile justice, the exploitation of children as victims, not just as offenders. Close to 600 million youth live in fragile or conflict-affected areas, representing approximately 1 in 3 young people worldwide. Human trafficking is one of the most serious and under-acknowledged international scourges. The key profit base for criminal traffickers is the exploitation of human beings as slaves. For youth, this exploitation takes 2 primary forms: sexual exploitation and forced labor. Young women and girls are disproportionately victimized for sexual exploitation, while young men and boys are more commonly targeted for forced labor, manufacturing, construction, domestic servitude, and armed conflict roles. The concept of double victimization is critical here. Many trafficked youth, particularly teenage girls forced into prostitution, are initially victimized by their traffickers, and then victimized a second time when they come to the attention of the juvenile justice system, which may label them as delinquent or vagrant rather than recognizing them as victims of a crime. Law enforcement in some countries simply turn a blind eye to sex trafficking, particularly when teenage girls are involved. The geographic distribution of trafficking reflects global economic inequality. Wealthy nations in North America, Europe, and Australia are the primary demand countries, the consumers. Less affluent nations, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, are the primary supply countries, the sources of trafficked youth. Child soldiers represent another form of extreme exploitation. Under international law, the minimum age for military recruitment is 18, and using children under 15 in hostilities is defined as a war crime by the International Criminal Court. Despite this, hundreds of thousands of children are currently associated with armed forces or groups around the world. Girls in conflict zones face particularly severe outcomes. They constitute the largest share of forcibly displaced persons, are frequent victims of war crimes, including systematic sexual assault, and are sometimes forced into early marriage as families try to secure some protection for them. The Boko Haram abductions in Nigeria in 2014, 267 girls taken from their school, with over 100 still captive years later, became a global symbol of this deliberate weaponization of childhood. Three international documents form the core framework for how the global community expects juvenile offenders to be treated. The Beijing Rules of 1985 were the first major international statement on juvenile justice. Developed at a United Nations meeting in Beijing, China, they set the philosophical tone for humane treatment of youth, not as criminals to be punished, but as individuals in need of guidance and correction. The Beijing rules call for the age of responsibility to not be set too low, for diversion to be preferred over formal court processing, for separate facilities for juveniles and adults, and for reintegration to be a central goal. Although not legally binding, the Beijing rules have served as the reference point for juvenile justice reform around the world since 1985. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted by the UN in 1989, is the most significant of the three documents because it is legally binding on the nations that have signed it. The CRC is one of the most universally adopted treaties in the history of international law, with one notable exception. Only two countries have failed to ratify the CRC: Somalia and the United States. For the United States, the primary obstacle was Article 37, which expressly prohibits capital punishment for juvenile offenders. At the time of the CRC's drafting, 22 U.S. states allowed the death penalty for offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crime. Only after Roper v. Simmons in 2005 eliminated juvenile execution did this particular barrier disappear. But the United States still has not ratified the treaty. President Obama publicly acknowledged that it was an embarrassment. The Senate must approve the treaty with a two-thirds majority, but the CRC has never been put before the Senate for a vote. The Riyadh Guidelines of 1990 focus on prevention rather than response. They take the position that most youth offending is a normal part of adolescent development, and that most youth will age out of delinquency without formal intervention. They warn against criminalizing children who are in irregular situations, street children, runaways, vagrant youth, whose behavior is better understood as a cry for help than as a call for punishment. Together, these three documents create a global philosophical framework that all but the most politically isolated nations have accepted. Youth who offend are fundamentally different from adult criminals and deserve a response focused on rehabilitation, protection of rights, and reintegration rather than punishment. Restorative justice is one of the most important innovations in juvenile justice globally. And it is significant that many of the restorative justice practices Americans now use were actually imported from other countries, particularly New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and European nations. The core idea of restorative justice is to repair harm rather than simply punish wrongdoing. Formal court processing, with its labels, records, and disconnection from the victim, often makes things worse for low-level juvenile offenders, strengthening their identification with a criminal identity and exposing them to more serious criminal networks. Restorative justice processes bring together the offender, the victim, and often the community to acknowledge harm, assign responsibility, and develop a mutually agreeable plan for making things right. The United Nations Basic Principles on Restorative Justice Programs explicitly recognize that power imbalances related to age, maturity, and intellectual capacity must be considered when using restorative processes with youth. The process must be free from coercion for both the victim and the juvenile offender. This is important because restorative justice, used incorrectly, can pressure victims into agreements they don't genuinely want, or pressure offenders into admissions that then trigger formal criminal consequences. The theoretical foundation for restorative justice with youth comes from Moffat's dual taxonomy, which distinguishes between the large majority of youth whose delinquency is adolescence limited, short-term, peer-driven, part of normal development, and likely to fade with maturity, and the small minority whose offending is life course persistent, beginning early, escalating in seriousness, and continuing into adulthood. Restorative justice is ideally suited for the adolescence limited majority, allowing them to address harm without being permanently labeled. For the life course persistent minority, more intensive intervention is appropriate. The international consensus reflected in the Beijing Rules and the Riyadh Guidelines is that the goal of juvenile justice should be rehabilitation and community reintegration, that youth who offend are primarily in need of assistance and guidance, not punishment. This consensus, reflected in systems from Norway and New Zealand to Japan, represents a return to the philosophical origins of the juvenile court system itself. The recognition that youth are fundamentally different from adults and that their capacity for change deserves more than a punitive response. Overall, Chapter 14 has 6 key takeaways. First, the age of criminal responsibility ranges from 6 to 18 globally. The United States falls below international standards, with some states setting the minimum as low as 6. The UN Beijing rules call for the age to not be set too low, and the UN has specifically criticized nations that set it at or below 12. Second, the 3 global philosophies of juvenile justice, welfare orientation, due process era, and punitive era, have been followed by nations around the world at roughly the same eras as the United States. This is not uniquely American. India's juvenile justice history illustrates how a single country can cycle through all 3 philosophies multiple times as political and social pressures shift. Third, delinquency is universal and primarily driven by urbanization, poverty, and social exclusion. Male offenders vastly outnumber females globally. Group delinquency is the norm. Most critically, countries that invest more in social welfare have lower rates of incarceration and juvenile detention. This relationship is consistent across 18 Western nations studied. Fourth, juvenile exploitation is severe and widespread. Human trafficking involves double victimization. Sexual exploitation is the primary form in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas. Recruiting children under 15 as soldiers is a war crime. Girls in conflict zones face particularly devastating outcomes. Pakistan, Angola, and Haiti are the most conflict-impacted countries for youth. Fifth, 3 key international documents, the Beijing Rules, the CRC, and the Riyadh Guidelines, form the global framework for juvenile justice. The CRC is legally binding, but only Somalia and the United States have failed to ratify it. The primary historical barrier was Article 37's prohibition on juvenile execution, which the United States addressed with Roper v. Simmons in 2005, though it still has not ratified the CRC. Sixth, restorative justice was largely imported to the United States from other countries. Moffat's dual taxonomy, adolescence limited versus life course persistent offenders, explains why restorative justice works for the majority of youth who will age out of delinquency. The global consensus, expressed in all 3 key documents, is that juvenile offenders need guidance and assistance, not harsh punishment, bringing us full circle to the founding principles of the juvenile court.